Today is Saturday, June 7th, 2025, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I posted an article that I'd like to discuss in this talk on why we study Latin in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's an important question to answer because I think many Catholics are interested in the study of the Latin language for the wrong reason. And this causes us to approach the study of Latin with too narrow of a focus. And I'd like to expand that focus a little bit because in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and in the history of Catholic education, for example, back in the Ratio Studiorum of the Jesuits in the 1500s, the interest in the Latin language was much broader than simply learning to participate in a Latin Mass. And I want to make it clear that in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, when you see the Latin language being studied and courses being offered to teach the Latin language, we're not simply providing a sort of tutorial on how to participate in a Latin Mass. We're actually pursuing real classical studies and seeking to become fluent as far as reading is concerned in the Latin language. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about why we study Latin in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, what our intentions are as we pursue a knowledge of Latin, and make it really clear so that students coming in of any age can understand what we're actually trying to do and why our Latin studies may seem much more rigorous, much broader than those in other Christian schools. And I want to say, I mentioned the Ratio Studiorum, that's Latin for Rule of Studies, that was published by the Jesuits in 1599, I think it was. It's worth noting that when we go back and we read that Rule of Studies and we look and ask, what did the students begin with when they studied Latin? And we find them reading Cicero, the Roman politician and philosopher. So even from the youngest age in those old Jesuit schools and medieval Catholic education, students were not introduced to the Bible or to the Mass or even to prayers. They were introduced to the writings of Cicero, classical Latin. So that's just an important point that I'd like you to keep in mind. But let's go ahead and discuss this article that was published today, and I'd like to add some comment as we go along. You can read this on the Academy website or just listen along, and I'll read and discuss it with you. And feel free to make any comments or ask any questions if you'd like any more information. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we're pursuing something very different than what other modern schools are pursuing. And remember, we're an accredited school, so we're not some strange, radical, countercultural program. We're an accredited K-12 school program, but we pursue the study of the classical liberal arts, a very different curriculum that is still respected and recognized by modern accreditation agencies. In fact, I was surprised myself when we went into the accreditation process. I wanted to make it very clear that we were not going to be changing our curriculum for the sake of accreditation, that I simply wanted to know up front if it was possible for a classical liberal arts study program to receive accreditation. And as I said, I was surprised to find how eager the accreditation evaluators were to encourage us to keep everything as it is and not think that we need to change what we're doing for the sake of accreditation. And so We went through the entire accreditation process, received great evaluations, and were awarded with accreditation without doing anything to change our classical Catholic curriculum. It's important to remember that. So while modern schools are abandoning the classical studies, abandoning classical languages, abandoning the classical liberal arts, they can't say that they're doing so for the sake of accreditation or college admission or anything like that. They simply are abandoning classical studies because either A, they don't want them, or B, they don't know how to go about offering classical studies. So in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we're on a very different path when it comes to education. We hold fast to time-tested, soul-shaping curriculum, the curriculum that has been developed and used all throughout ancient history, but most importantly during what's called the Classical Age. We're talking about classical Greece centered in Athens and eventually classical Rome centered obviously in Rome. We're concerned with classical education. The curriculum that we're offering our students is not created in order to serve the wishy-washy demands of a modern educational market. It's not intended to serve a certain political ideology. In fact, I would consider myself to be independent or moderate. Our curriculum and the program we offer in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is directed by reason, the faculty of reason, by history and by tradition in Catholic education. And a central part of this curriculum is the study of the Latin language. Now, some might suppose, as I mentioned before, some might suppose that we're studying Latin as Catholics simply because it's the official language of the Catholic Church. It is. And some may think that that's why we're interested in Latin, because it's the Catholic language. But that's not the case. We are not studying Latin because it's the official language of the Catholic Church. Rather, Latin became the official language of the Catholic Church because it was the language of the Roman Empire. The reason why Latin became the official language of the Catholic Church is because it was the language of the Roman Empire. That is why we are studying Latin. We're studying Latin because it was the language of the Roman Empire. And that's the same reason why it became the language of the Catholic Church. That language which served the Roman Empire was perfectly suited to the Church's universal and eternal, relatively speaking, eternal mission. So we study Latin for the same reason the Catholic Church adopted it, because it is the language of a civilization unmatched in clarity of thought, unity of purpose, and permanence of influence. Those are the real benefits of the Latin language. And that's really the reason why we study Latin, because it's the language of the Roman Empire, of Roman civilization. Normally, when we think about the Roman Empire, we think about emperors and soldiers, but the Roman Empire was not just a political force. It wasn't just emperors and soldiers marching through and conquering lands and governing people and collecting taxes. The Roman Empire was a civilizing agent. It brought civilization upon much of the ancient world. The Roman Empire built roads and cities. It brought law, order, and culture to every corner of the known world. Its influence penetrated to the furthest provinces of Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. So as the empire spread, it brought that civilization, culture, language, and so on to these remote parts of the world. It civilized the ends of the earth. And when the church emerged, it found in Latin not only a widely understood means of communication, but a vehicle that was actually capable of expressing the eternal truths of the Christian faith with unmatched precision and dignity. It was an excellent language, a language worthy of the Catholic faith. And Latin endured because it had already proven itself capable of preserving and transmitting the highest caliber of intellectual and spiritual goods. It wasn't chosen arbitrarily or sentimentally. It was chosen because it worked, because it could bear, as a language, it could bear the weight of theology, philosophy, liturgy, law, and so on. It was a language that was up to the task. And in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we study Latin with this same understanding. It's not a dead language to us. It's a living treasury of thought and tradition. It's a bridge that connects us to the great minds of the past and the timeless truths that they revealed. The language allows us to enter into the mind of so many of history's wisest and best men. And that's the main reason why the Latin language is so important to us, because of its connection to that glorious Roman civilization. It was the language of many of history's wisest and best men. The most compelling human argument for the study of Latin is that it was the language of the wisest and best men of history, many of them, many of the wisest and best men of history, men who shaped the Roman Republic, men who laid the foundations of Christian civilization, and men who defined Western or European intellectual life. It was their language. Going back to ancient Rome, we find men like Cicero, the Roman politician and philosopher who's considered really the master of the Latin language. His works De Officiis on duties and De Republica on the Republic are classics of moral philosophy and political theory composed in Latin. His Latin prose, which is famous for being clear, measured, and logical, set the standard for centuries of public discourse. He was the master. He set the bar for the language. Julius Caesar, the famous general and eventual leader of the Roman Republic, who was assassinated in 44 BC, he was not only a great general and statesman, but he was also very well known for his eloquence and his mastery of the Latin language. In fact, Cicero said that if Caesar didn't give himself to politics and military work, but devoted himself to scholarship, he would be one of the ancient world's greatest rhetoricians. Julius Caesar has left us works like the commentary on the Gallic War, which we can read as a history book, as almost a journal of the activities of the Roman army under his command. Just fascinating windows into ancient history, written in what he was famous for, just a straightforward, military-like, yet elegant Latin language. And again, his language serves as a model of that kind of focused narrative, that historical narrative, clear, concise, efficient, the language of the Roman military. And then we have Virgil, the great Roman poet, who wrote the story of Rome's destiny as being descending from Troy after the fall of Troy in the Trojan War. He wrote the Aeneid, the story of the travels and works of Aeneas. He wrote a Latin epic in the style of Homer's Odyssey and Iliad that not only celebrated the origins, sort of the mythical or legendary history of the founding of Rome, but which also served in later times as a cornerstone of Christian allegorical reading, figurative literature studies in later centuries. All of that, Cicero, Caesar, Virgil, all this incredibly rich library of Latin writings, which became the model and standard for all of the writing and literature of the medieval world. And beyond them, beyond the Roman statesmen and poets, when Latin became the language of the church, it became the language of the greatest saints, the greatest thinkers in Christian history, men like St. Augustine, who wrote the Confessions and the City of God in Latin, articulating, really working out through the Latin language all of the details of Christian theology, even getting into human psychology, articulating the church's eventual teaching on the role of God's grace in salvation. And he wrote in a profound Latin prose looking back to the models of ancient Roman Latin. St. Jerome, likewise, was commissioned by the Pope in the 4th century to translate the Bible into Latin, to become the official translation of the Bible in the Catholic Church, the Latin Vulgate Bible. St. Jerome's translation, his mastery of the Latin language and ability to translate from Greek and Hebrew into Latin, made God's word accessible to Europe and the rest of the West for over 1,000 years. And it goes on to St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the entire Summa Theologica in medieval Latin that would define Catholic theology and philosophy to the present day. And we think of all of the technical language, all of the ideas that St. Thomas had to articulate. The Latin language proved an effective vehicle for all of those ideas, as profound, as sublime as they might be. It's worth noting that even today, many of the writings of the greatest minds in Christian history remain untranslated. They don't exist in modern translations, and they're only accessible to people who can read Latin. For example, I regularly read the writings of St. Albert the Great, his commentaries on the works of Aristotle, which are only available in Latin, an incredible treasure of wisdom and teaching that is completely sealed to those who don't know the language. And there are countless other figures from Christian history: Boethius, Bernard of Clairvaux, St. Bonaventure Alcuin, Anselm, Gregory the Great, on and on. These are men who wrote, prayed, and taught in Latin. Their works are much more than just historical texts. They're fountains of wisdom in the original language of their thought. To study Latin is to gain direct access to the minds of all of these great men, to hear them speak, to read their actual writing without the middleman, without the translator, to be able to see exactly what they said, exactly what they wrote, and understand it for ourselves line by line. That's the great value and benefit of the study of the Latin language. We don't merely learn about all of these great men in history, we learn from them directly as our sources. We join their company, we enjoy fellowship with them, an intellectual and linguistic fellowship. That's why we study Latin. Now, one of the other great advantages of Latin is that it's a highly logical, structured language. English is sort of the language of a working class of people. In English, meaning is expressed, or meaning is signified by simply putting the words in a certain order. We start with a subject and then have a predicate and object. It's very, very simple. We present the ideas one at a time to our hearers or readers. A very simple language. But Latin really requires formal study and understanding. It's a much more technical, logical language that requires study. In Latin, the meaning of the author is embedded in the endings of words, not in the order of the words. And so much more attention needs to be paid to the words and their forms. And there's much more flexibility in Latin because as long as the endings are appropriate for what's being communicated, the ordering of the words is a secondary concern that may be put into the service of euphony rather than simple communication. And so that allows for great flexibility and expression, makes the Latin language an excellent language for prayer and for poetry and for music. But as you can tell, anytime you try to read Latin poetry or Latin prayers or Latin hymns, it demands a deeper understanding of grammar and syntax. So if you've ever tried to read a Latin hymn or even a prayer and you've struggled to understand it, that's not a mistake. That's not necessarily your fault. It is difficult to understand a Latin poem or a Latin prayer or a Latin hymn because there's so much flexibility in the language, it makes it difficult to read and understand without great mastery of Latin grammar and syntax. Studying Latin requires the student to think very clearly, logically, and precisely. It's really only for the most diligent and committed students. We can read stories, even of the lives of saints, who struggled to get through their required Latin studies for the priesthood. St. John Vianney is a good example of this. One of the greatest priests in church history, most faithful, devout priests to ever live, really struggled to get through his Latin studies because they are difficult. We've got to think clearly, logically, and precisely. You can't wing it. You can't be lazy or sloppy. As a Latin student, verbs must match their subjects. Cases must be identified and applied correctly, or things won't make any sense, or ideas will be communicated that were not intended. Interpretations and translations will not accurately capture what was being expressed by the author. Sentences need to be analyzed. They can't merely be guessed at. And this process, this process of studying the forms, the rules of syntax, the rules of prosody, and so on, it trains the mind in habits of attention, in careful analysis, in painstaking accuracy, And these mental skills that are necessary, that are just taken for granted by those who study and work with the Latin language, these are skills that are not only foundational to language studies, not just for Latin class, but they sharpen us and improve our ability to study every different intellectual discipline, every other subject. They make us better students overall. Just as mathematics trains the mind in subjects like quantity and relation, Latin trains the mind in structure and form. It cultivates a kind of intellectual discipline, establishes an intellectual culture that's very rare and necessary today, especially in an age of digital distractions where we tend to stay in a very superficial place intellectually and lazy, superficial communication. Latin is a remedy for this sloppy, lazy, shallow communication, which I'm really not criticizing, because for the sake of casual communication, modern communication is fine. For me to send a text message to one of my kids or communicate with my wife, just a simple, casual language is sufficient. But to really be able to move forward into higher and more complex ideas requires more accurate, more exact language, and Latin helps us to cultivate our minds to be able to work with language at that level. Even for me, my knowledge of the English language, my knowledge of English grammar is almost entirely drawn from my study of the Latin language. In fact, when I look at English grammar, I use my knowledge of Latin grammar to understand and make sense out of English grammar, because Latin is a superior language. So you can see that Latin serves this general purpose of preparing a mind, a culture of the mind that benefits every subject. And that leads us into consideration of different subjects and again, why it's valuable for us to study Latin in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And again, not just for the sake of any Latin liturgical use, but a much broader purpose. Latin is crucial for the study of philosophy, religion, theology, and so on. Latin has been the language of Western philosophy and Catholic theology for nearly 2,000 years. We can certainly make a case for Greek, and we'll talk about this in a little bit. We can talk about the excellencies of the Greek language, but much of the history of philosophy and theology was composed and is recorded in the Latin language. The works of men like Cicero and Seneca, who played crucial roles at some of the most important moments in human history. Works written before the birth of Christ as God prepared the world for the founding of the church and for the coming of the Son of God into the world. These pre-Christian Roman men, great, profound philosophers, full of wisdom and insight, they're still studied for their moral insights and for their rhetorical brilliance. My mind and soul was largely formed during my college years by these great classical philosophers, even more than by Christianity, which I was only getting started with. And even more important than them, even more important than these great classical masters, is the vast body of theological writing that's preserved for us in Latin, from the Church Fathers to the scholastics in the 12th and 13th centuries. That is from St. Augustine and St. Jerome all the way to St. Thomas Aquinas. All of that history of philosophy, religion, theological writings, and so on. All of that was recorded for us and is preserved today in the Latin language. The study of Latin unlocks all of that for us, makes all of those works accessible to us, which are not accessible to anyone who doesn't study to become fluent in Latin. Concepts of philosophy. If we just think about the study of philosophy and concepts that we talk about, the concepts can't be separated from the words that have been used to express or signify those ideas. Words like substance, essence, act, potency, form, matter, cause. All of these philosophical concepts are more clearly understood when we study them in the original Latin language. The same is true of Greek. The words aren't just labels that can be sloppily replaced with other words. They really are precise philosophical instruments. These words were carefully chosen, sometimes even carefully crafted, to perfectly communicate a philosophical idea. And when we read translations, even though translations are very helpful, translations can often obscure the depth of the original language, while the ability to go back and study the language directly, to study the Latin text directly, reveals the exact meaning of many words and passages that really can't be understood through translation. And Latin preserves, in addition to that, Latin preserves the unity of Catholic doctrine through the centuries and remains the official language of the Catholic Church to this day. When we read the Latin of the Catechism or decrees of ecumenical councils, again, we enter into a linguistic world where specific spoken signs are used to represent very carefully worked out ideas. These ideas, even the selections of the words, were made by the doctors of the church and great theologians. It's not for us just to sloppily choose our own words for these things. The words themselves are extremely important for understanding in these studies of philosophy and theology. And when we gain mastery of the Latin language, the linguistic or the language barrier between the present and the past is taken away. And that's really an amazing privilege to enjoy, to have direct access to the writings of history's wisest and best philosophers and theologians in both classical and Catholic history. The same can be said for law and government. When we think about American politics and American history, the Constitution, the Founding Fathers, and go back to English law and European law. In fact, I'm taking a course this summer at Harvard on the history of European law, so I'll be interested to keep my eye out for this subject as I work through that. But when we look back through this history of Western government and law, it's all rooted in Roman law. Some have even referred to the West really as a continuation of Roman civilization. And Latin was the language of that civilization. Latin is the language in which Roman law, European law, even American law was written and applied. Legal maxims or expressions are commonly presented in Latin because there's just no better way to articulate them. Phrases like lex talionis, the law of retaliation, or habeas corpus, you shall have a body, and ipso facto, by the fact itself. Phrases like these, we hear these phrases today. We can hear them in the news as we listen to legislators and lawyers talking about current events. We'll hear these phrases come up still. The Latin language being used to articulate ideas because we just feel that it articulates the ideas more accurately. The structure and the concepts of modern law, contracts, property rights, criminal responsibilities, all of these things. We didn't invent American law. These legal ideas descended to us from Roman jurisprudence, from Roman law. We've inherited these things, and the language in which they come to us is the Latin language. And so law and government all are opened to us through the study of the Latin language. The American founding fathers, as I mentioned before, were all educated in the classics. And they adopted many Latin legal concepts in the formation of the Constitution and other founding documents of the American government. Not just the federal government, remember, but most of the founding fathers were also working to establish their local and state governments and state constitutions and laws and so on, all drawing from this history of Roman law and Latin language. Terms like amicus curiae, de facto, pro bono. These phrases continue to shape our legal vocabulary and our legal thought. Latin is not merely the language of past laws, the laws of the Romans. It's the language of law itself. Not just Roman law, but law, period. And so in learning Latin, students gain access, a unique access, to the political ideas and to the rhetoric that shaped the rise of constitutional government and democracy. The ancient Latin speeches of Cicero, who, just so you know, lived at the same time as Julius Caesar, before the founding of the Roman Empire, during the Roman Republic. Those speeches present a vision of the rule of law and duties of citizenship that still applies today, 2,000 years later. And all of that comes to us and is accessible to us through the Latin language. What's true of philosophy and theology, law and government is also true of medicine and science. In fact, this past week, as I mentioned in another talk, I spent a few days with my brother-in-law, who's a physician, and he kept laughing. As we would talk about things, he would go off talking about some of his medical expertise and discussing medical issues and giving examples of things we were talking about. And he would laugh because he realized that when he would use a medical term that normally no one else knows the meaning of, for me it was all very simple because I simply understood the language. I understood the Latin. I knew what the words meant without medical studies because I simply know the language of the art of medicine. And so though Latin is often associated with the humanities or with philosophy and theology, maybe even with law and government, it's always served the natural sciences as well. Until the modern period, Latin was the universal language of scholarly communication. It was the language of academia. Students who went away to university couldn't go to university until they met the prerequisite. And what was that prerequisite? They had to be fluent in Latin. That's why children were sent to grammar school all through history. The purpose of the grammar school was not simply to teach children how to write and speak rightly. It was not to teach them to speak rightly in their own native language. It was to teach them to become fluent in Latin so they could go and participate in the academy, in the university, and so on. And so when we hear that saints in the past, like Saint Dominic, would be sent away to the university at age 14, what qualified them to go to the university was not just their behavior, but also their fluency in the language of the academic community, which was Latin. And so all through history, all through the development of the modern natural sciences, the language of that development was primarily Latin. The famous biologist Charles Linnaeus, or Carolus Linnaeus, used the Latin language to classify plants and animals in the system of nomenclature that he developed. And you're probably familiar with the old Latin names for plants and animals. That system of naming plants and animals, which is called nomenclature, that was developed by a man named Charles Linnaeus. And he used the Latin language to create this system of naming all of the plants and animals. And why did he do that? Because he knew that the Latin language could handle that task. And so we hear phrases that we should be familiar with, like Homo sapiens, right? Thinking or rational man. Canis lupus. Canis meaning dog and lupus meaning wolf. Quercus rubra. Quercus meaning oak and rubra meaning red. This system of naming plants and animals was made in the Latin language in the modern era. When we think of the study of medicine or anatomy, the parts of the body have almost all Latin names, anatomical terms such as femur or femur in English, ulna, corpus callosum. If you've studied anatomy, I did because I was a pre-medicine student before I took up the study of classics. It was almost a Latin vocabulary course, or maybe a Latin and Greek vocabulary course. These studies of the sciences of medicine and natural sciences, they're interwoven with the Latin language. Medical prescriptions written by physicians are often found to use Latin abbreviations and so on. So to study medicine, biology, or chemistry at a deep level, to really study for understanding and mastery is going to lead a student to encounter the Latin language constantly. Even my own children, though they may have fussed about me making them study Latin when they were at home, when they went off to college and took up their college studies. My daughter is a medic in the military, so she is immersed in medical studies. They always remark at how useful their knowledge of Latin, even though they sort of kicked against the goads, they have to admit that the Latin that they learned became very helpful as they entered into their professional studies. The Latin is not a burden, not a hindrance to modern medical or scientific studies. Rather, it's a tool, a very useful tool that can accelerate our learning in the sciences. So we've seen philosophy, theology, law, government, medicine, science, and it just continues into the humanities, into literature, music, and art. The literary legacy of Latin is immense, almost impossible to comprehend. Because remember, when we talk about older cultures, when we talk about ancient Rome and medieval European cultures, we're talking about people who didn't have radios and televisions and smartphones and the internet and YouTube and social media and so on. There was so much more motivation to write poetry or compose music in that culture because it was the source of entertainment. I mean, imagine if you didn't have the television and videos and the radio and music and all of these different media sources that we have today. And again, I'm not complaining about them. They're great. But imagine living without those things, and if you wanted to hear music, you had to play it. You had to go sit down at the piano and play it, or you had to sing the song that you wanted to hear, or have someone else sing it. If you wanted to have a party and have music at the party, someone at the party had to play the music. And so there was much more motivation to study music and practice music, to develop skill at music, and so on. And the same thing was true with literature, poetry, stories, and so on. If you wanted to go on an adventure, you couldn't put on a movie or listen to a podcast. You would have to read a book. And so the greatest minds worked to compose the greatest stories. And so there was much more emphasis in older times on literature and music than there is today. And that's understandable. Maybe it's a good thing. But we have names like Virgil, Ovid, Horace, Livy, these famous Roman poets who created works of epic poetry, lyric poetry, historical literature, just geniuses, masters of language and literature that shaped Western literature and really became the study material for 2,000 years. Even when we read someone like Shakespeare living in the 1500s, all of Shakespeare's plays and writings are filled with references to these ancient Roman poets and historians. These ancient Latin authors were the models studied and imitated by medieval poets like Dante and Petrarch. They were the models studied and imitated in the Renaissance by famous writers like Erasmus, and for countless modern writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and William Shakespeare and many, many others who have drawn upon not only their language, but their themes and the forms of their writing, and so on. When we come to the church and look at music, Latin hymns and chants, such as the Te Deum and the Dies Irae, this Latin history of music has become the foundation of Catholic worship, not to mention Gregorian chant. All Gregorian chant, the entire Psalter, the Divine Office, the liturgy of the Mass, and so on. And not just Catholic music, but all Western sacred music. This is the kind of music that I share on the Classical Catholic radio station. Later composers like Palestrina, Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, Johann Sebastian Bach, and Mozart commonly used Latin texts to create their most famous, most transcendent works. Latin wasn't just the text of the Mass. It wasn't just a special language used for some formal occasions. It was the language that inspired the highest accomplishments in music and literature. And likewise, in visual art, if we go and look at the fine arts in terms of painting and statuary, sculpting, architecture, and so on, we find Latin inscriptions all throughout the history of Western art. Latin inscriptions upon churches, upon monuments, government buildings, in paintings, and so on. Latin mottos all through society, used all the time. Every state has a Latin motto. Every college and university, most schools have Latin mottos. These Latin mottos, there's just something about the Latin language that succinctly, that efficiently communicates the idea, that represents the institution. They encapsulate the values and beliefs of patrons, artists, rulers, teachers, and so on. And to be able to look and read these inscriptions and understand them in the context of this great tradition is to enter into the mind and the soul of the culture that produced them. It's really to enter into a fellowship, an intellectual fellowship, a cultural fellowship, a linguistic fellowship. That is really one of the greatest benefits of classical studies and of Latin studies in particular. And the benefits just go on. We can talk about modern foreign languages, what are called the Romance languages, Spanish, French, and getting into English, not to mention Italian, Portuguese, and so on. So when the Roman Empire collapsed, the Latin language didn't die with it. It transformed, it evolved, and grew into what we call the Romance languages. And as I named them before, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and so on. These languages weren't merely inspired by Latin. They are actually Latin, simply in a later stage of its development. Over 80% of the vocabulary of the Romance languages derives from Latin. And the grammar of these modern languages retains many of the features of the grammar of Latin. So for a student who studies Latin, not only is the Latin language accessible to him, but he has easy access into all of the European languages, all of the Romance languages. I, for example, have studied Spanish, and I'm quite fluent in Spanish because of my formal studies in Spanish, but I can read French and Italian, not because I've studied them, but simply because I know Latin. So it gives us access to these modern European languages, which evolved from the ancient Latin language. The same is true of English. In English, Latin gives us, or the knowledge of Latin gives us a massive advantage over other students as far as linguistics is concerned. Over 60% of English words come from Latin. So a person who knows Latin, a person who studies Latin, is simultaneously building a very great English vocabulary. And this is especially true, as we've mentioned before, this is especially true for academic vocabulary, scientific vocabulary, philosophical, theological vocabulary, technical vocabulary, some of the most important vocabulary, not common everyday street talk, but learned communication and language. Latin provides students with a great advantage in all of these different areas of study. English words like justice, virtue, transcend, incorporate, we can go on forever. All of these words, so much of the English language is simply an evolved form of Latin. And we can trace much of our English vocabulary to Latin roots, and when we encounter words in English that we've never seen before or read, we can know their meaning simply because we know Latin. I remember shocking one of my colleagues when I was a private school teacher. There was an English teacher who didn't know Latin, but she taught English, and I came into the faculty lounge one day, and she was working on something, preparing lessons or whatever, and she looked up at me and said, "Mr. Michael, you don't happen to know what the word excrescence means, do you?" And I said, "Yeah, that's easy. Ex means out of, and crescens means growing. So excrescens means something that grows out of something else. And she looked at me like I was a magician, because the ability to understand English words for someone who's studied Latin is just so simple, so basic. And for English-only students, the only way that they can learn the vocabulary is to memorize it, whereas there's no need to do that if you already know the Latin language. So studying Latin gives students in all of these modern languages a powerful foundation for understanding, learning, and mastering all of these modern languages. It creates a kind of linguistic glue that gathers together, connects all of these different vocabularies and all of this different grammar of different languages really into a single system that's easy to understand. Those are all the benefits, more benefits of studying Latin. Now, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, which we usually mark around 500 AD, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Catholic Church preserved the Latin language by taking it up as its official language. Christian monks copied Latin handwritten books by their own hands and kept the language. Schools taught Latin grammar and rhetoric. The Mass was in Latin, the Bible was in Latin, the prayers of the church were all in Latin. The church, in the medieval times, saved the Latin language, but not just the Latin language, it also saved the culture and civilization that came with the Latin language. All of that was preserved in the Catholic Church. And then throughout the Middle Ages and even into the modern period, which when we say modern period, we usually mean from 1500 onwards. Think about when Columbus discovers the Americas. That's the beginning of the modern period. Latin still remained the language of educated men and women all across Europe. It was the language, as I said before, the language of university instruction, the language of correspondence between scholars, of negotiation between different government leaders. The Latin language gave Christendom, that is the nations that were all governed by Christianity, it gave them a unity of language that mirrored their spiritual unity. So that entire Christian medieval world was united by this Roman culture and Latin language. And Latin was used as a shield against any kind of manipulation of the language. It saved, it preserved fixed meanings of terms in theology and philosophy, something that we see so much trouble with in modern society in English, where ideas change and there's all kinds of movements, philosophical movements, all kinds of false teachings and false ideas that develop that simply continue to use the same English words with different meanings. And Latin protected us from that error, which is called equivocation, the changing of the meanings of words over time, which can be very deceiving. Latin protects us against that. It's a shield against these corruptions in language. It preserves fixed meanings in important subjects like theology and philosophy. It allows us to transmit or to pass on the truth in an accurate way. Latin maintains a standard. It's like a rock that never moves. And so while culture can fly all over the place and all kinds of ideas can come and go, the Latin language, especially because it's not an actively spoken language, is just sort of preserved in carved stone, and it holds the truth for us. It preserves that ancient Roman and later medieval Christian civilization, keeps it for us. Latin's also important for the study of the liberal arts, which is obviously crucial for us in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. We've inherited the liberal arts tradition. This is not something that was invented by Christians. This existed long before the Christian church was established by Christ. We inherited the liberal arts tradition from the Greeks and Romans, and much of that liberal arts tradition was communicated in Latin, in and through Latin. The study of grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the 7 liberal arts, much of it has been taught and preserved for us in Latin texts, as you probably know very well in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy because we study them. These subjects were discussed and developed by men who communicated and preserved their thoughts and teachings in Latin writings, which are accessible to us who know the Latin language. So to understand the liberal arts fully, to practice them and to study them in the way that they were meant to be practiced and studied, one must be able to read and, even more importantly, to think in Latin. That's an important skill that often doesn't get talked about, the ability to think in Latin, to read and understand something written in Latin, not necessarily to compose Latin, but to read and think and understand the Latin language. Translations always lose a little bit. It's like playing the game of telephone where kids pass the message down a line, and with every child who hears the message and shares it with the next child, something's lost. And by the time you get to the end of the line, sometimes the whole message has been lost. And that's what happens often in translation, especially when translators aren't held accountable to the original works. We often find in modern translations very loose translations, which are more like interpretations. And by looking at the translation, we can't even be sure that the translator knows the original language. It's one of the reasons why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we always translate literally word for word, at least the first time through, to prove that we're dealing with the original language. Translation always loses a little, and we've got to resist that in our translations. And this is especially important when we're dealing with really important, complicated ideas, subtle arguments, and complicated reasoning. So to read an author like Boethius or Augustine or Thomas Aquinas in their own words is really to have the best access to the liberal arts and the philosophical and theological sciences. It's like having direct access to the authors themselves. Many important works in the classical liberal arts, as I've mentioned, like the commentaries of St. Albert the Great on the writings of Aristotle, they've never been translated into modern languages, and so the only people who even can read them today are students who have become fluent in Latin. So for our study of the liberal arts, the knowledge and use of Latin is very, very important. I mentioned before the relationship between the study of Latin and government, but the whole concept of democracy, even though it comes to us from ancient Greece, owes a lot to the Roman Republic and to political theory in ancient Rome and medieval Europe. Concept like the word republic, which comes from the Latin phrase res publica, the Senate, which comes from senatus, citizen or city, which comes from civitas or civis, and liberty from libertas. These were all ideas that were central to Roman thought and part of this Roman language that communicates this thought, and they've remained central to political thought ever since. As I mentioned before, the founders of the United States studied Latin very intensively. They read the writings of Cicero, and they sought to imitate all of those concepts that were communicated by those ancient Roman authors. Words that we use in modern government like veto, which simply means I deny, or referendum, or the word Senate. These words are not simply words that we use to refer to past ideas, but they're a living part of our modern constitutional government. A student of Latin, again, is not just studying the language. He's learning a political philosophy, a whole civilization that has shaped our society today. We also have to talk about the formation of the soul. We talked about how the liberal arts education is soul shaping. Latin is not just a useful language. It doesn't just get ideas across. It's also formative. It shapes the soul. The study of Latin requires virtue. It demands patience. It demands diligence, humility, perseverance. It's not learned easily. It can't be faked. It reveals and tests a student's character and builds in him habits that are necessary for lifelong learning. Often when students come into the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, their parents are concerned. They don't know if this is going to work for them and so on. And that's really true, because these studies are going to test the virtue of our students. These studies are going to require that you grow spiritually. They're going to require that you live a Christian life and that you pray and that you persevere and trust in God's grace and ask for God's help and so on. These studies are difficult and they challenge us to grow spiritually and morally. They form our soul indirectly. When we read Latin, we're not merely reading words. We're entering into the writings of saints and wise men and poets. These are men whose minds are far beyond our minds. They're expressing ideas that are far beyond our comprehension, and it's always difficult for us to study these great writings. We take our place, though, in this long procession of wise and virtuous men. We take our place. We ourselves enter into this fellowship of men who seek what is good and true, and who find in the words of this great language a way of expressing and sharing these great ideas. That's what's so beautiful about the classical languages, especially Latin. Now, before I wrap this up, and I know I've already gone long, over an hour, I'd like to answer one question that I often get asked, which is, why in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, why do we start with Latin rather than Greek? Why do we put more emphasis on Latin than Greek? I'd like to answer that because it's a good question. Greek was the language of Homer, Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle, on and on. Obviously, it's a language of some of the greatest thinkers, maybe even greater than Roman thinkers. I mean, no one's greater than Aristotle, and he was a Greek. Even more, Greek is the language of the New Testament, the language in which the apostles wrote the inspired books of sacred scripture. Even the first councils in church history, they were conducted in the Greek language. Why in the world would we choose to study Latin rather than Greek? Shouldn't we give Greek equal or even greater attention than Latin in our studies? It's a really good question. Greek is obviously a noble language. And again, I recommend you study both. So this isn't an either-or decision. Really, for us, it's a question of which should we study first. Greek is a wonderful language. It offers us the opportunity to study the richest poetry, the writings of Homer, the greatest philosophy, all the works of Plato and Aristotle, early Christian writings of great fathers of the church like St. John Chrysostom. All of that was written in Greek. And Greek, even though it was the universal language in the East, it was Latin that became the official language of the Catholic Church. And that wasn't an accident. That wasn't just a coincidence, but it actually was a providential development that's rooted in the nature of language itself. Latin is a superior language. Now, when we look, we ask, well, how in the world did Greek get involved in all of that in the first place? How is the New Testament written in Greek? What are the Jewish apostles doing writing in Greek? And the answer is that Greek spread to the east. So think about, if you know geography, think about where Greece is in the Mediterranean Sea. To the east of Greece, Greek spread all through the world because of the conquests of Alexander the Great. That's called Hellenization, where the whole Eastern world was introduced to Greek civilization when Alexander conquered the Eastern world. All the way beyond the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, all the way to India. All of that was brought under the control of Alexander, and he brought this Aristotelian Greek culture with him wherever he went. But by the time of Christ, Common Greek or Koine Greek had become the common language in the East, and both Jews and non-Jews used that Greek language. And that's why the Gospels and the epistles of the New Testament were written in Greek. They were, by writing in Greek, they could be widely understood by the peoples in the Eastern Roman Empire. So in the East, again, Greek was the language of the East. And even today, if you look, you can see the Eastern Orthodox Church is also referred to as the Greek Orthodox Church. So those two terms, Greek and Eastern, are used interchangeably. And so we see that, we acknowledge that. We acknowledge that the early history of Christianity in the Eastern lands used the Greek language. The problem, however, was that as the church grew, it spread to the West. And so as it moved to the West, Latin replaced Greek as the official language of the church. So as long as Christianity was centered in the West, culturally, it used the Greek language. But over time, as the center of Christian life moved to the West, really to Italy and Europe, the Latin language took first place. So Greek was expressive and elegant. It's also very complex. Some might say it's even too flexible to provide exact definitions that are required by a study like theology. It's so flexible that it may be too flexible. It might not be clear enough. And the richness of the Greek language, which is wonderful for poetry and philosophy, it often allows for a lot of ambiguity or a lack of clarity. It's not as clear and precise as the Latin language. Latin is very precise, very economical, very stable. Think about the Roman character. The Romans were very practical. Latin was the perfect instrument for defining terms, distinguishing between ideas that were similar but different, for establishing clarity in doctrine and so on. Latin was just a better language for what Christianity needed to do in the world. And as time went on, Greek really stayed in the East, as I said. It was never adopted as the language of Roman law or government or worship in the Western Roman Empire, centered on the great eternal city of Rome. And when the empire divided between East and West, Greek stayed in the East, and Latin became the language of the Western Empire. It was used by all of the Roman administrators, the judges, the lawyers, the poets, the soldiers, and then by Christian bishops, monks, and theologians. So Latin became the language of the Roman Catholic Church and of medieval Europe. When the empire fell, when the Western Empire fell, the western half of the Roman Empire, Latin was preserved, as I said before, by the Catholic Church. It became the language of the Mass, the Bible, the creeds, the councils, the schools, and so on. Greek faded to the East, and Latin endured. The monasteries copied and preserved Latin writings. Latin was taught in the church schools, and eventually Latin was the language of the great universities in the Middle Ages, like the University of Paris and Oxford University and so on. And so that's why if we understand the difference between the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, and how really civilization moved west over time, I explained this in our world chronology course. That's why Latin became the real foundation, the real core language of Christian civilization in the West rather than Greek. The church didn't just pick Latin. It embraced Latin because there are important virtues in the Latin language, really the virtues of the Roman Empire. It's clear, it's stable, it's orderly, it's universal, and so on. The virtues of the Latin language made it the ideal language, not just for teaching, but also for passing truth on to future generations where understanding could really be difficult. Latin is a great language for the preservation of the truth, and that's really the purpose of the church. It's to preserve the sacred deposit of faith that we've received from Christ and the apostles. So Latin is just a great language. It's the perfect language for the Christian religion. It remains the official language of the Catholic Church. And we've got to distinguish there, because we see today the church recommending that we move to local languages like English and Spanish and French and so on, even Chinese, Indian. So when we talk about Latin being the official language of the church, we're not saying it's the necessary language of the liturgy, because the liturgy is different. That's where the people of God come together to worship. In the Catholic Church, after the Second Vatican Council, we're united by the form of worship that's the same everywhere in the world, and not by the language, as far as the liturgy is concerned, even though the liturgy can still be celebrated in Latin. But when we say that the official language of the church is Latin, we're talking about that doctrinal and administrative language of the church. That remains Latin after all these years. So Greek may be studied, and in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we recommend that students study both Latin and Greek. It's especially valuable for philosophical and theological studies. I mean, to study the New Testament in the original language is a Greek study. But as far as our studies go, Latin really should come first and hold pride of place. It's not merely a classical language. It's the permanent language of Catholic culture. It's the foundation of the Western Church as far as language is concerned. And it's the surest and most reliable instrument for the transmission of Christian wisdom. And again, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we love the Greek language and study it diligently, but we start with Latin, plain and simple. So we see that Latin was chosen by the Catholic Church not because of any kind of superstition or just a nostalgia, like a love for Rome. It was the best tool for the Church's mission. It was a language of law, of government, of philosophy, of culture. It proved over time, and continues to prove, its capacity to convey truth with clarity and with solemnity. It's fitting for the use in these grave circumstances. It's a language that's worthy of government. It's a language that's worthy of law and philosophy and theology and science and medicine. A language that's worthy of the gospel. And so in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we study Latin, again, not because it's the language of the church. That's not why we study Latin. We study Latin because it's the language of Roman civilization, and that's why it's the language of the church. We study Latin out of conviction, not just because it's the way things are. We believe that the Latin language, which united the Roman Empire and expressed the faith of the church as that faith developed and required very, very careful explanations. And that language that educated the minds of saints and scholars is still extremely valuable for us today. And that's why we study Latin in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I hope that's helpful. God bless.